really hard to predict where we're going, so don't count on me to give you confident predictions about what's coming next, but I'll give you some scenarios at least. So here we have the three leaders who are about to face off over the CUSMA review, Canada-US Mexico agreement, also known as USMCA, which I will use at some points, and also TEMEC in Spanish. Bizarrely, this latest agreement has three official names with the order of the countries reversed, depending on which country you're in, which shows you a little bit about the state of North American integration right now. And the term North America couldn't be included in the title anymore because that wouldn't match Trump's politics. So anyways, here we are. Some very recent statements from Trump about the CUSMA review. As you probably heard in the news, he said it's irrelevant. Canada loves it. Canada wants it. They need it. We don't need them. We don't care about them. We don't need their products. Fine. And you see where he is. I thought was very symbolic kind of sight. He's at the Ford motor plant in Dearborn, Michigan. They proudly display Ford and the American flag with him. Somewhat less belligerently or more equivocally, Jameson Greer, who's the U.S. trade representative, said, could it be exited? Yeah. Could it be revised? Yeah. Could it be renegotiated? Yes. All these things are on the table, which I think is more accurate reflection of reality. But also we have heard Jameson Greer say that he and the US has a strong preference for bilateral deals, which would suggest that we're not going to have a CUSMA when we come out of this time period. So that's, what's at stake right now, which are big, heavy stakes for Canada and Mexico especially, but also I'd say for the US. So I have done quite a bit of work on regional integration. I mentioned at the bottom a couple of references there. And so for that work, there's the huge literature, as you may know, on regional integration, which rarely refers to North America. It's interesting, even though NAFTA was like the first, US-style trade agreement of the new era of neoliberal trade integration. Still, there's not a lot of people have worked on how do we think about this theoretically. So the main work on regional integration draws from the European context, the EU. The main one I'll just mention quickly is neo-functionalism. People like Haas, who conceived of integration as kind of an inevitable, gradual process led mostly by state technocrats, a kind of apolitical process. And they said they will start with easy apolitical type agreements like around steel and coal, and integrating on a low level will create problems that can only be addressed by higher levels of integration. And so inevitably we kind of snowball towards higher levels of integration, as has happened in Europe. But that approach seems to work only for the European context and doesn't apply to all the other cases of regional integration around the world that have occurred since the European process began. So I instead draw on this new regionalism approach that is based on non-European cases, so it's not as Eurocentric, it's not teleological. It doesn't say that if higher levels of integration are inevitable. It highlights the politics and the role of the context. Also, they talk about uneven globalization. So there's a lot of focus on the global political economy context as opposed to the European literature that's more inward looking. They talk about some of them, not all of them, but some of them draw subconsciously on constructivist theories and highlight the importance of ideas, values, and norms. They focus more on informal processes of regionalization, so the focus isn't on constructing durable institutions in which sovereignty is transferred from Asian states to supranational bodies like the EU. Instead, there's more focus on the economic processes, environment, culture, other aspects of regional integration that are more informal in nature. And they also talk about non-state actors, especially firms, which are weirdly kind of not very important in the earlier approach. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but also the role of civil society, which is Patty mentioned, I've worked on a lot over the years. For this talk, I'm actually updating some of the early work I did and drawing on a chapter I wrote with Noah Fry. That's forthcoming in a Mexican book on North America. Noah's now a postdoc at Dalhousie, so shout out to Noah. I don't know if he's watching. Okay, so that's kind of the theoretical background. I'm actually not gonna do as one should do as a good scholar and really pull this through the whole presentation, but kind of keep that in mind. I am going to talk, well, I am a little bit doing that, so I won't be so modest. Okay, so I just put on the slide here the gradual process of higher levels of regionalization that has occurred in North America. I won't go through the details because you probably know about this, but just to say, with the signing of the CUSMA, it's sometimes referred to it as yet another common name, which is NAFTA 2.0, which conveys the idea that there wasn't a lot new there. A lot was just transferred from the old NAFTA agreement, despite the fact that it was supposed to be the worst trade deal ever, to the new agreement. But there were some important differences. For many people, the most positive aspect of the new agreement were the labor provisions, which I can go into later. I'm happy to answer lots of questions about that. As Patty said, that's what I'm working on most right now. They also took out the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism for Canada-US relations. And this also by civil society is seen as a big achievement because that was like the biggest target of criticism by civil society actors. For reasons I could also discuss later. They didn't take it out entirely for US-Mexico there, which is interesting. So there's kind of it's like there's two processes almost going on within the same agreement. Some provisions different for Mexico than for Canada and the US. Stronger rules of origin in autos. So more of the final automobile had to be produced within North America to qualify for exemption from tariffs. So this is a really important aspect of the agreement that we should keep in mind, okay? Other stuff. And critically, it contains this 6-year review clause, which we're going to be talking about. So at first, the US said there should be a sunset clause. So yeah, when was it going to end? 6 years? 10 years? I forget. Anyways, the US said it was going to end after 10 years or something, and that would be it. And if you wanted a new agreement, you'd have to start from scratch. Canada and Mexico strongly resisted that because it was clearly in the interest of the United States to do that. So they instead said, let's have a review after 6 years. But it's still the US agenda. And I would say maybe it's even worse in a way, but it gives more power to the US, which is going to be the difficult party in any attempt to renew or continue with the agreement. But I'll talk more about this review clause in a bit. In general, we should keep in mind that in contrast again with Europe, there are not really any institutions established under CUSMA, just like NAFTA, even less than NAFTA. But as a result of this agreement, we do see gradually intensifying regional integration at the economic level, not the political, but the economic level. So just some stats. Since the USMCA took effect, intra-regional trade in goods and services has grown by 37%, mostly driven by growth in industrial supplies in the automotive sector. So autos are key. The agreement also helped spur a 16% rise in foreign direct investment across the region. So higher and higher levels of integration. We could argue about how beneficial that is. There are certainly critiques of that, but that's what we're seeing is the cross-border integration of supply chains, especially in the auto sector, but also other important sectors. But the fundamental character of the agreement is pretty constant compared to NAFTA, as we see in this graph, where you see a growing gap between wages in the US, Canada, and Mexico. So this only goes 2024. I think actually Mexican wages are now that left out of this graph, but still very low compared to US and Canadian wages. And there's a big gap between US and Canada, which you keep in mind. And Canada's leveled off, whereas US keeps increasing. But that fundamental asymmetry in the region between the poorest country, where you have workers working for low wages, and the richer countries where you have high wage labor has not disappeared, it's intensified. And that's fundamental to the USMCA model. So moving forward, we have Trump coming back after renegotiating NAFTA and saying it's now the best deal. Then we have Trump 2.0 and his, we're all aware of what's been going on, I'm sure, with the steady, implacable imposition of diverse types of tariffs on diverse goods. And here we can distinguish between the initial tariffs that are imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers, IEEPA, which are intense and justified for at least for Canada and Mexico in terms of we need to do this because there's a national security emergency because you guys aren't controlling the border, including Canada, and all this fentanyl is coming over the border, even though, as we know, not very little fentanyl is coming from Canada to the US, but that's the rationale. And then on the other hand, we have a more traditional tactic of US trade policy, which goes back for decades, which is the use of Section 232 of the Trade Act, which refers to, again, to national security rationale to explain why they need all these tariffs on such diverse products. It's strangely difficult to get a list of all the tariffs. And I did this kind of on the train coming down. I could be wrong about pharmaceuticals. Does anyone know if they actually did impose it? Pharmaceuticals? Anyways, whatever. So don't quote me entirely, but that's, apart from that, I think it's pretty definitive. And clearly this is an incredible onslaught on countries like Canada and Mexico that are extremely dependent on the US market for their well-being. The big exception to all this is the fact that the US agreed to a carve out of the imposition of tariffs on goods that are compliant with the CUSMA. So remember I said earlier, there's this rules of origin thing. If it's determined that a product is 75% produced in North America, then the tariffs aren't imposed, which is a really, really big deal for both Canada and Mexico. But we don't know if we'll keep that carve out. So that's what's at stake. So I have a little bit of data. I'll try to go through it quickly. I'm not a data person, but I have a wonderful PhD student, Chris Moore, who compiled this for me just to get a sense of what's actually happening in terms of the impact on all three countries. But I'm focusing really on Canada and Mexico. So for these graphs, the black line shows the trade balance, like the surplus or deficit in trade between the two countries. And the red dotted line is the price index for US goods. And that's important because when you compile trade data, you include not just like the
tons of steel that you're shipping, but also the price of that product. So that's what makes up how you calculate what the deficit or surplus is. And in general, then that would mean that you'd have the trade balance kind of tracking prices if there's no other factors going on, all things being equal. And you do see that basically is happening here with US and Canada, that yes, so the black line shows an increase in Canada's trade surplus, which is not good if you're worried about US trade politics, because that's what their assessment is, their deficit. This shows the US deficit in trade between the two countries growing pretty dramatically after 2021. But it's not that we're shipping more products or we're not employing more people, it's just that the prices have gone up. In general, that's the main thing happening. But then if you look at steel, you get a very different picture, because for steel, the tariffs are hitting them really hard. And so you see a decline in the Canadian surplus, and that is very far apart from the price level. The price is like pretty high, and they're not converging, like they're diverging. So that shows if you looked at the price as well, then that shows we're shipping a lot less steel to the US. And this is hitting the steel industry and steel jobs really hard. So they're in an existential crisis, I would say, the steel industry and aluminum, which I didn't put up here. But I did put autos. So here too, it's not following the price. The price level is diverging from what we're shipping to the US, like both auto parts and finished autos, or autos, parts and bodies. So there's been a decline in the trade surplus, but it predates it predates these new tariffs. It's a long-term tendency that Canada is producing less autos. A lot of this auto production is going to Mexico because they have lower labor rates. So we need to be concerned about that. And then this graph shows which imports to the US are compliant with USMCA. And the USMCA goes back further, and you see that it wasn't that high, not because they weren't being produced in North America, but because it was extremely time-consuming and expensive to prove that every single little widget in your product was being produced in North America, not in China or India or wherever. So the tariffs said USMCA goods are carved out. So then firms quickly go out and hire a whole bunch of logistical people and lawyers to prove that their goods are being produced in North America. So in fact, most goods going to the United States are covered by CUSMA. Okay, that all makes sense. So so that leads Carney and others to be able to say, well, we're in the best position of any country in the world because so much of our exports are being carved out. But that, forgets the long-term implications of this other data about what's happening with steel and aluminum, and especially what's happening with autos, where there is a profound crisis, I would say. Okay, moving on from data. How do we make sense of this? Going back to my theories, I think clearly what's happened in the global political economy has played a fundamental role in this shift. And so we're trying to explain now, why is there this dramatic shift away from neoliberal approaches to trade towards neo-mercantilist approaches, which I'll explain in a minute. This all began earlier, especially after the 2007-08 recession, but has intensified since then, especially under the unique character of the Trump administration and the Trump presidency. So something else is going on other than just abstract global political economy forces because it's intensified dramatically now. So here I do turn predominantly to ideational factors in this way that neo-mercantilism has replaced neoliberalism. It's not new, right? Like Biden was adopting policies that were not neoliberal, and which were like America First type policies, but it's just intensified under Trump. So neo-mercantilism, drawing on Eric's excellent book, I highly recommend The Neo-Mercantilist, but it only goes up to 39. Yeah, so it needs to be updated. That's your next task, Eric. He defines neo-mercantilism as a belief in the need for strategic trade protectionism and other forms of government activism to promote state wealth and power in a post-Smithian age, post-Adam Smith, which we're certainly in. That's still a pretty good definition. So why are we there? And that approach involves a heavy focus on balance of trade. Like to neo-mercantilists, it really matters whether you have a trade surplus or trade deficit. And Trump just is obsessed, as is all his top economic advisors are obsessed with the trade deficit that's the US has. But we should keep in mind that there are different approaches to neo-mercantilism, and as Eric also points out, it's compatible with a wide range of different political orientations. So it could be very conservative, or it could be quite radical, could be socialist. So the devil is in the detail. It's extremely variable. So also other factors are these economic advisors, people like Oren Cass, Stephen Mirren, Peter Navarro, etc. Just fascinating. I just found out about this America First Policy Institute. If you want to know, it's not just about trade, it's about all issues that the MAGA people are concerned about. Like the gender stuff is scary. So I would recommend looking at their website. It's really pretty fascinating. But they're obviously advocating these neo-mercantilist policies. Trump himself is like, for some bizarre reason, just addicted to the idea of tariffs. I would add in the gender agenda, which has not been highlighted too much, although when I was teaching global political economy last year, I heard a speech by David Fromm, who's well-known Canadian, who's Republican advisor in the past, but anti-Trump, who said, this is not about economic interests, it's about gender, because the MAGA Republicans are fundamentally concerned about the threats to masculinity and to good jobs for young men, especially white men. And that's what these policies are about, is getting people to work, not just anywhere, but in good, what they consider good jobs, which are manufacturing good jobs for manufactured goods. That's what they consider is a good job. They don't really, they do care about, AI and Bitcoin and stuff. But for creating jobs, what this policy is designed to achieve is to get young men jobs in the way they were losing jobs in the context of the shift to the Rust Belt and all that. Interesting take. But also we see very strongly this element of neo-imperialism, the earlier references to the Manifest Destiny, and also the Dunroe Doctrine, the emphasis on the Western Hemisphere as a site of American strength. China's got off pretty easily in this whole process. There's intermittent references to Canada as a 51st state, and then other targets of the US ire, like Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and now Greenland and Mexico, as I'll discuss in a minute. So that's shaping this as well, that whole geoeconomic view of the world, that the US needs to dominate this hemisphere. They basically need to kind of own the hemisphere and determine what happens in the whole hemisphere. I added this thing about affect, and I didn't mean to highlight in yellow. That just I meant to think about it some more. But there is a whole literature on the role of affect in political science that I need to think about some more. But I feel like we need to think more about emotional aspects of politics these days, and where the effective, like the psychological orientation of the leaders of the government are taking us. So yeah, I just threw that out. Um, we also saw like the dramatic response to the Doug Ford ad. I thought was very interesting, like a way of like cognitive dissonance. Like they're trying to channel the idea that this Republican hero, um, Reagan, would support these policies, which you clearly would not. But they took such fundamental offense at the idea that Doug Ford was saying, no, Ronald Reagan had paid all these policies. Like it's just like this challenge to their worldview, which tries to bring together people like Reagan and these neo-mercantilist policies, which fundamentally doesn't make any sense. But that strong reaction, I think, is very telling. And as I mentioned earlier, I would also emphasize the non-state actors, especially corporations. They may prevail. They have prevailed in keeping the CUSMA carve-out that I think clearly responds to U.S. corporate interests, who, car industry in particular cannot function if their industry doesn't receive a reprieve from the tariffs. But they have been strangely silent. Like they're not politically out there putting their case forward about why neo-mercantilism is a bad idea. And then there's interesting stuff happening around labor, the contest over labor. So you have the UAW in the US supporting the trade agenda of the Trump administration, whereas Unifor in Canada is like profoundly critical. And Trump is trying to appeal to a labor constituency while not really supporting higher wages or anything that would actually really benefit American labor. But also there is interesting organizing happening at the trinational level between unions and labor advocates and people. I've been participating in meetings that bring together activists from the three countries trying to articulate an alternative agenda, which I want to talk about. Okay, how much time do I have?
So you're almost at 30 minutes.
Okay. So I won't go into a lot of detail here because I want to get to the end. So we pretty much know what's happening in Canada. So there's my slide. That's what we're seeing happening. I just threw in the Carney stuff. We take the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. So Canada's kind of rapidly pivoting towards going back to China in the context of this onslaught and threats from the United States. And the provinces are doing interesting, contradictory things. And importantly, there's been measures adopted to support affected sectors like steel in particular and aluminum. But they need to do more about autos, I would just say. Mexico, you might know less about, but I did put up this famous picture of Claudia Sheinbaum, the current president, with the showing like in a cheeky fashion. She's like defying Trump, but in a kind of low-key kind of faction, showing the map of North America with the Estados Unidos Mexicanos on it, the previous map of North America before the US took over half of Mexico. So she's just a fascinating character who's been able to navigate these shoals pretty well in terms of keeping her calm, maintaining positive relationships with Trump while standing up to him in some ways, especially now we're seeing this with Venezuela. My takeaway is that Mexico is less vulnerable than Canada to these trade policies because the US will need cheap labor from some source, and Mexico only makes sense. So they can't afford to increase or to decrease US wages so that they would be competitive in international markets. You know, other competitors have very low wage sites for their labor intensive products. So the US needs to compete with them. So they really ultimately need Mexico, and they also need Mexico to address some big priorities like drug trafficking, migration, etc. So Mexico's kind of playing this balancing act of like standing up in some ways, trying to push like desperately for a renewal of the CUSMA agreement, but also complying in really important ways. So they didn't impose retaliatory tariffs as Canada originally did, but then backed down on. They've been cooperating heavily on security issues and are going to ramp that up in light of what happened in Venezuela. And interestingly, which is something I want to work on more, is they're going back to an import substituting industrialization strategy, which is the strategy that Mexico adopted after World War II, or during, well, after the revolution and later. So basically a neo-mercantilist strategy. They're going back to that and something that's called Plan Mexico, which involves substantive support to key sectors like autos, pharmaceuticals, etc. I can talk more about that. So there's a very interesting strategy going on there, but they are, I say they're less vulnerable, but of course they're more vulnerable in other ways, especially around military security issues, with members of the Trump administration, the Republicans, itching to go into Mexico with a military strike of some type, whether it be drone attacks on the cartels or boots on the ground, we don't know. But there's a strong impetus on the Republican side to use military force against Mexico, which of course Mexico is profoundly concerned about. So another outcome might be increased Canada-Mexico operation, which has always been like the weakest pillar of the North American economy. We don't trade with each other very much. We don't do very much with each other. And one aspect of Carney's response has been to try to promote stronger ties with Mexico and elevating Mexico's position as kind of a strategic ally, which it's never held in the past. And went to Mexico. Mary Simon was just in Mexico. I don't know if you heard that, and met with Sheinbaum, which was seen as like a great thing because she's an Indigenous woman. And as you see here, Claudia, although very much not Indigenous, is wearing Indigenous outfit and is a woman. And so that resonates well there. So they have an action plan, but it is not amounted to very much. So far in this data, we see that actually the level of Canada-Mexico trade is declining a little bit. So it'll take a while to make this a real thing, but I think it's a positive thing. Okay, so we have the CUSMA review coming up. The deadline is July 1st. Trump keeps saying, oh, it's going to end July 1st or something. It's like gone. If we don't get an agreement, this is wrong. If we don't get an agreement to renew, then Trump talks will continue for the following 10 years. We'll be going through this agony every year for 10 years until they come up with some kind of agreement to renew. So that's the timeline. There's consultations going on. The US did set out some priorities. Jameson Greer made a speech because he's required to by Congress, actually. However weak Congress may be, they actually do require that the USTR make a statement about what they're going to try to achieve. Those are the main asks in that speech to Congress. It's kind of vague. People want more detail, but at least they've said something, whereas neither Canada nor Mexico has actually said what we want to achieve other than renewal of the deal as is, which is what they really want, but which is extremely unlikely. So we're coming up to July 1st. They have been having talks. We don't know what's happening, how positive they are. So what are the possible outcomes? They could, Canada and Mexico could get their way and just, well, I'm not sure that even those governments really want exactly the same text. But basically they want the status quo. They want to keep that agreement and have it renewed for the next 10 years. That, I think, has never been a likely scenario. It just won't fly in the United States context. We could also see the US withdraw. So there is a provision in the agreement that says with 6 months notice, you can withdraw. So we could see that happen. As Greer said, everything's on the table. That could happen. But I also think that's pretty unlikely given the weight of economic interests in the US in favor of some continuity. Okay, so that leads to more likely scenario, which I think is just a stalemate. So we won't get a deal. I think it's very unlikely we'd get some kind of agreement by July 1st, given where we are right now. It's not very far away. In which case the agreement just continues as a sort of zombie deal. So we'll have the same provisions, but we'll keep talking or, going on and on, which, in some ways, I think that's not such a bad outcome. Like the Canada and Mexico keep saying, we need a deal. Do we need a deal? Do we need a deal at any cost? Do we need just any deal? I would say no. Because the US will impose harsher conditions in any deal they're willing to sign that are more disadvantaged, are going to hurt Canada and Mexico more. So as Jim Stanford, well-known Canadian political economist, says, no deal is better than a bad deal. But keep in mind, that's not great either, because there is this harsh impact on sectors like autos, steel, aluminum, porous products, et cetera, et cetera. So that's not good either. And over time, the impact on the auto industry is really profound. So we are going to see, I think, more investment going to Mexico or the United States from Canada. So it's not like this is a great outcome to have no deal, but it's probably better than just any deal. And then maybe we will see the US compromise because stuff is going on. There's been, we could get the midterms. The midterms are happening next November. The Republicans are likely to lose the House, and Congress does really control, are supposed to control trade policy. If they have any kind of backbone, it's in their hands to sign any deal. So things could change there. There's going to be economic pressure from the tariffs. Trump's popularity levels are pretty bad. So there could be some compromises there. Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, so just to conclude, what do we make of all this? Oh, I put up the photo that went out on Truth Social of the Canada, Greenland, US, and Venezuela at the bottom. We realized at first Venezuela was there, but the US flag over it, showing US aspirations. That's what, you have to take this seriously. It's not a good photo, it's actually from a European sphere. So it's a profound challenge. It's in a way an existential challenge for Canada. And we need to take it seriously. So, the instinctive response has been this elbows up idea, which, is good. But I think we need to go beyond that kind of defensive response to think seriously about what direction the Canadian economy should take in this context and the Mexican economy. And so here I'm floating this idea of variegated neo-mercantilism. So there's a famous article by Tickle Heck and what's his name? Somebody talking about variegated neoliberalism, which is a more surprising context, a concept, the idea that neoliberalism doesn't take the same shape in every country. It varies across country and between times. Neo-mercantilism is more like that from the beginning. It's always been distinct depending on the historical context in which it's embedded. So I think we need to be thinking in neo-mercantilist terms, maybe not throwing out all of neoliberalism or all of continental integration, but think about new ways in which the Canadian state can be active promoting industrial strategy, which used to be a term you just could not use in Ottawa. Nobody would take you seriously if you talked about an industrial strategy. Now we're there very rapidly. And we need to think about the care economy, as Marjorie Cohen argues in a new collection that's on the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative site, that the economy is not just about goods that we ship across border or goods, but also about the care economy. So how do we bolster that while also promoting industrial production? You know, we have this new Carney doctrine. Be interesting to discuss that because it's changed since I even did this PowerPoint. I think we need to think about anti-imperialist alliances. So Venezuela got kind of a pass from Carney, like, okay, you go there, no problem, we don't care. But Greenland was a step too far. So why are we concerned about kidnapping of other heads of state? And then finally, I think it's really important to think about the labor reform process that's happening in Mexico. We can talk about more. That was encouraged by the CUSMA agreement and the provisions in CUSMA, but also has roots in the Mexican political system. Because ultimately, we need to narrow that gap between Mexican wages and Canadian and US wages if we want to build a better North American